So I wear two hats in most of what I do. As the one hat, I do history of anatomy. I'm an historian by training, and what I study in that case is the way that people have dealt with anatomy, meaning human bodies, animal bodies, how they dealt with bodily fluids, concepts of bodies, how have they thought about bodies. The other hat that I've worn in my work is as an activist, as a patient advocate, or I sometimes say as an impatient advocate for people who are patients of doctors. In that case, what I've worked with is people who have body types that challenge social norms. So some of what I've worked on, for example, is people who are conjoined twins, two people within one body. Some of what I've worked on is people who have dwarfism, so people who are much shorter than typical. And a lot of what I've worked on is people who have atypical sex, so people who don't have the standard male or the standard female body types. And as a general term, we can use the term intersex for this. Intersex comes in a lot of different forms. I'll just give you a few examples of the types of ways you can have sex that isn't standard for male or female. So in one instance, you can have somebody who has an XY chromosomal basis, and that SRY gene on the Y chromosome tells the protogonads, which we all have in the fetal life, to become testes. So in the fetal life, those testes are pumping out testosterone. But because this individual lacks receptors to hear that testosterone, the body doesn't react to the testosterone. And this is a syndrome called androgen insensitivity syndrome. So lots of levels of testosterone, but no reaction to it. As a consequence, the body develops more along the female typical path. When the child is born, she looks like a girl. She is a girl. She is raised as a girl, and it's often not until she hits puberty and she's growing and developing breasts, but she's not getting her period, that somebody figures out something's up here. And they do some tests and figure out that instead of having ovaries inside and a uterus, she actually has testes inside, and she has a Y chromosome. Now, what's important to understand is you may think of this person as really being male, but they're really not. Females, like males, have in our bodies something called the adrenal glands. They're in the back of our body. And the adrenal glands make androgens, which are a masculinizing hormone. Most females, like me, I believe myself to be a typical female. I don't actually know my chromosomal makeup, but I think I'm probably typical. Most females, like me, are actually androgen sensitive. We're making androgens and we're responding to androgens. The consequence is that somebody like me has actually had a brain exposed to more androgens than the woman born with testes who has androgen insensitivity syndrome. So sex is really complicated. It's not just that intersex people are in the middle of all the sex spectrum. In some ways, they can be all over the place. Another example, a few years ago, I got a call from a man who was 19 years old who was born a boy, raised a boy, had a girlfriend, had sex with his girlfriend, had a life as a guy, and had just found out that he had ovaries and a uterus inside. What he had was an extreme form of a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. He had XX chromosomes, and in the womb, his adrenal glands were in such high gear that it created essentially a masculine hormonal environment. And as a consequence, his genitals were masculinized, his brain was subject to the more typical masculine component of hormones, and he was born looking like a boy. Nobody suspected anything. And it was only when he had reached the age of 19 that he began to have enough medical problems, actually from menstruating internally, that doctors figured out that, in fact, he was female internally. Okay, so just one more quick example of a way you can have intersex. Some people who have XX chromosomes develop what are called ovotestes, which is when you have ovarian tissue with testicular tissue wrapped around it. And we're not exactly sure why that happens. So sex can come in lots of different varieties. The reason that children with these kinds of bodies, whether it's dwarfism or it's conjoined twinning or it's an intersex type, are often normalized by surgeons is not because it actually leaves them better off in terms of physical health. In many cases, people are actually perfectly healthy. The reason they're often subject to various kinds of surgeries is because they threaten our social categories. Our system has been based typically on the idea that a particular kind of anatomy comes with a particular identity. So we have the concept that what it means to be a woman is to have a female identity. What it means to be a black person is allegedly to have an African anatomy in terms of your history. And so we have this terribly simplistic idea. And when we're faced with a body that actually presents us something quite different, it startles us in terms of those categorizations. So we have a lot of very romantic ideas in our culture about individualism. And our nation is really founded on a very romantic concept of individualism. Well, you can imagine how startling then it is when you have children who are born who are two people inside of one body. Where I ran into the most kind of heat from this most recently was last year when the South African runner Caster Semenya had her sex called into question at the International Games in Berlin. I had a lot of journalists calling me, asking me, which is the test they're going to run that will tell us whether or not Caster Semenya is male or female? And I had to explain to the journalists, there isn't such a test. In fact, we now know that sex is complicated enough that we have to admit nature doesn't draw the line for us between male and female, or between male and intersex and female and intersex. We actually draw that line on nature. So what we have is a sort of situation where the farther our science goes, the more we have to admit to ourselves that these categories that we thought of as stable anatomical categories that mapped very simply to stable identity categories are a lot more fuzzy than we thought. And it's not just in terms of sex. It's also in terms of race, which turns out to be vastly more complicated than our terminology has allowed. As we look, we get into all sorts of sort of uncomfortable areas. We look, for example, about the fact that we share at least 95% of our DNA with chimpanzees. What are we to make of the fact that we differ from them only really by a few nucleotides? And as we get farther and farther with our science, we get more and more into a discomforted zone where we have to acknowledge that the simplistic categories we've had are probably overly simplistic. So we're seeing this in all sorts of places in human life. One of the places we're seeing it, for example, in our culture today, in the United States today, is battles over the beginning of life and the end of life. We have difficult conversations about at what point we decide a body becomes a human such that it has a different right than a fetal life. We have very difficult conversations nowadays, probably not out in the open as much as within medicine, about the question of when somebody's dead. In the past, our ancestors never had to struggle so much with this question of when somebody was dead. At most, they'd stick a feather on somebody's nose, and if it twitched, they didn't bury them yet. If it stopped twitching, you buried them. But today, we have a situation where we want to take vital organs out of beings and give them to other beings. And as a consequence, we're stuck with having to struggle with this really difficult question about who's dead. And this leads us to a really difficult situation where we don't have such simple categories as we've had before.